The desert air was clear enough to see the lane reflectors wink past in a rhythm, the kind of night where distance looks empty until it isn't. A modified Volvo XC90 ran north through Tempe at about 43 miles per hour, a black roofline crowded with sensors and a halo of cameras watching the road. Inside, a single safety operator sat behind the wheel, hands near but not on it, eyes drifting down and back up as the system shouldered the work. The center display traced lanes and boxes around moving things, cars, curb, a signpost. Ahead, the asphalt widened into several dark lanes bordered by a median and a low path that crossed nothing marked as a crosswalk. A woman stepped off that path, pushing a bicycle loaded with plastic bags, angled across the travel lanes toward the median. The car's LiDAR saw her first, a cluster of points that moved with purpose. The car saw her. It did not settle on what she was. The time was 9:58 p.m., March 18th, 2018. The posted limit was 45. Uber's test vehicle had been running this loop for hours, collecting what engineers call exposure, miles that teach software how the world is built. The company had recently changed its safety model in Arizona, one operator instead of two. The Volvo's standard forward collision assist disabled when autonomous mode was engaged. Uber's own emergency braking logic suppressed to avoid harsh false stops. The human was the backstop. If the machine hesitated, the person was meant to see it sooner. About 5.5 seconds before impact, the system registered an object ahead. It did not match a trained category. It reclassified it as a vehicle, then as a bicycle. With each change, the software started a new prediction about where the object would go, and each prediction bought the system a moment of inaction, a guardrail against overreacting to ghosts that now worked against it. The crossing woman, Elaine Hertzberg, moved steadily in the same line. She wore dark clothes. She was not running. The bicycle rolled at her side. The operator, Rafaela Vasquez, had been on the road most of the evening. The cabin was lit by screens, a dash cam pointed at the road, another at her face. She glanced down, then up, then down again. Investigators would later say her phone was streaming a show. In interviews, she said she had been monitoring the interface. The camera showed her eyes off the road for stretches long enough to matter. At about one point, 3 seconds before impact, the software concluded that a collision was likely and that hard braking would be required. In Uber's setup that spring, autonomous emergency braking was disabled at speed in autonomous mode, in part because sudden stops had caused rear-end risks and complaints. The system would not hit the brakes on its own. It would not sound an immediate audible alarm. Control would transfer only when the human took it. The car stayed at speed. Hertzberg reached the third travel lane. The operator looked up. The grille met bicycle and body in a single thud that threw both forward and left. The Volvo's brake trace showed a late, reflexive push after impact. The car rolled to a stop farther up the road. For a moment, there was only coolant steam and the ping of hot metal. Headlights laid 2 cones of light over bags and the bike frame. Elaine Hertzberg lay beyond them, barely moving. Tempe police arrived to an unusual scene that still felt familiar. A victim in the road, a driver beside a damaged vehicle repeating the first lines of shock. She came out of nowhere. I didn't see her, except here the driver said something no officer expected. The car was driving itself. Officers followed the beam of the dash cam's inward-facing lens to a screen that had captured the last seconds of attention and inattention. Paramedics worked a rhythm on Hertzberg that stopped and started and stopped again. At the hospital, she was pronounced dead. She was 49. By morning, the video had reached newsrooms across the country, the outward camera showing an empty road, and then, abruptly, a person in the headlight wash, the inward one showing the operator's eyes down, then wide as she looked up. The clip compressed a chain of technical choices into a few seconds a layperson could understand. It also hid the parts the camera could not see, how the software had failed to lock on to a simple, steady crossing because it kept changing its mind. How a design meant to curb false positives withheld action until it was too late. How disabling the Volvo's built-in collision avoidance created a single point of failure at highway speed. The National Transportation Safety Board opened a formal investigation. Uber suspended its self-driving operations in Arizona, and then everywhere, parked the fleet and issued statements about grief and cooperation. Governor Doug Ducey, who had welcomed the testing regime, froze the company's testing privileges in the state. Engineers in Pittsburgh and San Francisco pulled logs and replayed the night on screens that could slow time to the millisecond. The curves looked clean. Detection, reclassification, prediction, suppression, recognition. The space left for the human narrowed until it wasn't space at all. Weeks turned to months. The NTSB's fact-finding placed numbers on what had felt like a ghost story. 5.6 seconds, time between first detection and impact. Multiple classification flips. The software could not agree on what, and therefore could not agree on where next. 1 second action suppression with each new classification. 1 operator instead of 2. No driver monitoring system to alert for gaze off the road. The company had reduced safety operators in part to improve efficiency. It had also trimmed a formal hazard analysis program that might have flagged the risks. The environment mattered too. No crosswalk, low light, a pedestrian crossing mid-block. Toxicology on Hertzberg later showed impairment, a detail that would inflame but not erase the primary storyline. She crossed a road. The car saw her. No one slowed in time. In November 2019, the NTSB named a chain of causes: the operator's failure to monitor and intervene, Uber's inadequate safety risk management and oversight, the system design that withheld automatic braking, Arizona's permissive testing conditions, the pedestrian's decision to cross outside a crosswalk. It read like aviation reports always do, unemotional sentences that nonetheless carry weight for every name inside them. The board issued recommendations to industry and states about safety management systems, driver monitoring, and the unacceptability of disabling automatic emergency braking without compensating measures. Legal consequences landed unevenly. In 2020, county prosecutors declined to charge Uber criminally, focusing instead on the operator, who had been alone, on duty, and, by their count, looking away at the worst possible time. Rafaela Vasquez was charged with negligent homicide, later pleading guilty to endangerment in 2023 and receiving probation. It was the narrow personal end of a wide systemic failure. One person in a seat at the moment, the math ran out, carrying the weight of decisions made far from that lane. Uber rebuilt its program before trying again. When the cars returned to limited testing, they did so with 2 operators, strict speed caps, automatic emergency braking active, and a closed list of scenarios they were allowed to handle. Driver-facing cameras were tied to real-time alerts. Checklists grew teeth. City partners asked to see not just presentations but hazard logs. The public conversation turned from promises to tolerances. What level of technical certainty is enough to put a machine next to a person at 45 miles per hour? On the ground in Tempe, paint faded, and the road stayed what it had been. Several wide lanes where people crossed because their lives ran on both sides. At a small memorial, someone taped to a light pole. The plastic flowers flattened and brightened in the sun by turns. For months after, drivers who knew the story slowed at that stretch of the road, without deciding to, hands easing on the wheel because a particular space on a map carried a memory now. The most honest lesson of the night is practical. If a system can see a person for seconds and not act, that gap has to be designed out, not left to a single human to fix at highway speed with a glance up and a late foot. If you disable a car's last-ditch brake, you'd better replace it with something faster than panic. If you say the future will be safer, The present has to carry the proof. Hard alarms, two sets of eyes, rules that slow a car before pride does. The crash will sit in executive slide decks and academic papers as a case study, how a path from promising to deadly can be paved with plausible choices that, in combination, remove every margin. On a warm night in March, those margins were gone. The software argued with itself. The line of sight from a face to the road blinked closed and opened too slowly. A person walked across a street the short way people do when the long way is far off and the night looks empty. The car saw her. It did not act. The person beside the wheel did not act in time. In the space between those two failures, Elaine Hertzberg's life ended. Thank you for listening to Road to Ruins. Subscribe for more true stories where systems fail and people pay the price.